There are stories that a civilization tells about itself, and there are stories it works very hard not to tell. The first kind fills museums, gets inscribed on monuments, and gets taught in schools. The second kind accumulates in the silence beneath those stories, in the gaps between official records, in the testimonies no court ever heard, in the photographs that circulate for a moment and then are forgotten by everyone except the people who lived inside them. What follows is a story of the second kind. It is a story about a strip of land roughly 40 kilometers long and 12 kilometers wide, wedged between the Mediterranean Sea and a series of military checkpoints, home to nearly 2.25 million people who have been living under a blockade for almost 2 decades. It is a story about what happens when the world's most powerful institutions, the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the Security Council, the Geneva Conventions, are applied selectively, and what happens to the people who fall into the gaps that selectivity creates. But before we go any further into the mechanics of this story, the legal documents, the military operations, the diplomatic maneuvers, I want to start somewhere much smaller. I want to start with a 14-year-old boy and a photograph, and the enormous distance between what the world saw in that photograph and what actually happened. The boy's name is Faris Odeh. The date is October 2000. The place is the outskirts of Gaza City, on a road that Israeli Defense Forces tanks have rolled into following the outbreak of the Second Intifada. A photographer named Laurent Rebours, working for the Associated Press, is on the street when Faris walks into the frame. Faris is carrying a stone. Ahead of him, perhaps 30 meters away, sits an Israeli tank. He winds up and throws. The image travels instantly around the world. Within days, it appears on front pages in a dozen countries. It is described as a modern David versus Goliath. It becomes a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of a people who have nothing left but stones to throw at machines that cost millions of dollars and carry enough firepower to level a city block. What the photograph does not show is this. Faris goes to school every morning carrying an extra set of clothes in his bag. After lessons, he changes out of his school uniform, joins the protests in the streets, and throws stones at the soldiers. He is careful to avoid cameras, not because he is ashamed, but because he knows his parents will be frightened. When his mother eventually finds out what he is doing, she sits him down and weeps. He promises her he will stop. On the morning that turns out to be his last, he waves goodbye differently from the end of the road, walking backward, facing her, smiling. She remembers it as the clearest image she has of him. He is smiling. A sniper's bullet pierces his neck. 2 days later, Faris Odeh dies in a hospital bed. He is 14 years old. His mother keeps the photograph. Not the famous one, the one where he stands defiant before the tank. She keeps a photograph of his face. To the world, her son was a symbol. To her, he was a boy who waved goodbye walking backward. And this is where this story begins, not with the symbol, with the reality behind it. Because the story of Gaza, the story of Palestine, is not a story of symbols or geopolitical abstractions or competing nationalisms. It is a story of specific, named people who have been living inside a catastrophe for 75 years, building their lives in the ruins of previous catastrophes, and then, systematically, failed by every institution that was supposed to protect them. It is a story about the systems built after the Second World War, the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the Geneva Conventions, in the explicit aftermath of industrialized atrocity to ensure that what happened to the Jews of Europe could not happen to any people again, and what those systems did and failed to do and chose not to do when the catastrophe came for another people. Before we go any further, several questions need to sit with us through everything that follows. None will be answered immediately. Each is answered slowly through the accumulation of evidence. The first, how does a people survive 75 years of displacement without a state, without sovereignty, and without a credible path to either? And what does that survival cost? The second, why did every international mechanism built after World War II consistently fail to protect the people most in need of protection? Not through negligence, but through choices made by specific, named accountable institutions and governments. The third, who decides which suffering becomes a global cause worthy of arms embargoes and emergency sessions and front-page photographs, and which suffering becomes a number in a quarterly report that no one reads? The fourth, what does it mean that the world's most powerful democracy supplied the weapons, the diplomatic vetoes, and the unconditional political backing that made every stage of this catastrophe possible? And continued to do so even as international courts began using the word genocide? And the fifth, what happens to a generation of children born into a blockade, children who have lived their entire lives without a single day free from the sound of drones, from the possibility of a missile, from the knowledge that the walls around them are not metaphorical? To answer these questions, we have to go back, a long way back, to the time before the catastrophe had a name. Before 1948, Palestine was a place, not an abstraction, not a disputed territory, not a phrase in a UN resolution, a place. It had olive groves and orange orchards and fishing villages along the Mediterranean coast. It had ancient cities, Jerusalem, Haifa, Jaffa, Hebron, with populations of Muslims, Christians, and Jews who had lived alongside one another for centuries, not without tension but without industrialized violence. It had a literacy rate that exceeded many European countries. It had a vibrant urban culture in its larger cities, a press, a professional class, a peasant economy in its villages, and a layered, complex social fabric that was, by any historical measure, a functioning society. By 1949, more than 750,000 of that society's people were gone. Their villages, more than 400 of them, were destroyed. Their homes were occupied. Their olive groves were plowed under. Their wells were, in some documented cases, poisoned. Their books, an estimated 70,000 volumes, were looted from their libraries and taken to the Israeli National Library, where many remain today, cataloged as abandoned property. The society that had existed for centuries was gone, not damaged, gone. The Palestinians call this the Nakba. In Arabic, the word means simply the catastrophe. What caused it? How it unfolded? Who gave the orders? These questions have been debated for decades, with historians on different sides presenting different interpretations of the same evidence. What is not in serious dispute is the scale of what happened, the speed with which it happened, or the outcome: a people dispossessed of their homeland in a matter of months, scattered across refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, the West Bank, and Gaza, and refused the right to return. That refusal is now 75 years old. It is one of the longest-running refugee crises in human history, and it is the foundation on which everything that follows in this story is built. To understand how the Nakba happened and why it was allowed to happen, we need to go back further still, to a document written in 1917 by a British Foreign Secretary named Arthur James Balfour. A letter, really, just a few paragraphs, addressed to a prominent member of the British Jewish community. In it, Balfour wrote that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and would use its best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of that object. It is worth pausing on what this document was. It was a promise made by one empire about the future of a territory it did not yet control, on behalf of a people who did not yet live there, concerning land already inhabited by another people who were not consulted. The letter mentioned that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The existing non-Jewish communities at the time constituted roughly 90% of Palestine's population. The letter is 27 lines long. Its consequences are still unfolding. Before we go further into how those consequences unfolded, I want to take a moment. This channel exists to tell stories like this one, Stories that matter, stories where the truth is layered and complex and has been deliberately simplified or buried by the volume of noise around them. If this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It keeps this work possible, and it keeps these stories free. Every episode we produce is and will remain free to access. And quickly, before we continue, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Drop your city, your country, wherever you are, in the comments below. Are you listening from London, Nairobi, New Delhi, Baghdad, Los Angeles? Let me know. Now, back to where we were. We were standing in 1917 with a letter that would become the opening chapter of a catastrophe. Between 1917 and 1947, Jewish immigration to Palestine increases dramatically. First a trickle, then, as Hitler's persecution of Jews accelerates across Europe, a flood. The people arriving are not conquerors in any simple sense. They are refugees from genuine terror, survivors of genuine catastrophe, carrying with them the accumulated trauma of centuries of European anti-Semitism and the fresh wounds of the Holocaust. They have, by any moral reckoning, a profound claim to safety, to home, to a place where they cannot be persecuted. What they arrive into, however, is not empty land. It is a country. In November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passes Resolution 181, the Partition Plan. It proposes dividing Mandatory Palestine into two states: a Jewish state covering roughly 55% of the territory, and an Arab state covering 45%. The Zionist leadership accepts. The Arab states and Palestinian leadership reject it. Their rejection is often cited as the moment Palestinians chose war over peace. But the plan allocated 55% of their homeland to a Jewish state at a time when Jewish residents owned roughly 7% of the land and comprised roughly 1/3 of the population. It would have converted the majority of Palestinians, the indigenous majority on their own soil, into a minority in a state not their own. The Arab states and Palestinian leadership say no. By December 1947, Zionist paramilitary forces, principally the Haganah, with operations also conducted by the Irgun and Lehi, begin a systematic campaign to secure territory before the British mandate expires. The campaign is called Plan Dalet. Its objectives, as stated in original documents declassified in the 1980s, to gain control of the areas of the Jewish state and defend its borders. In practice, this means the expulsion of Arab populations from strategic towns and villages across the country. What follows over the next several months is a series of operations that historians have called, without significant dispute, a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Village after village is attacked, its residents expelled or killed, its buildings demolished. The wells that sustained those villages for generations are poisoned or sealed. The olive trees planted by generations of Palestinian farmers are uprooted. And then there is Deir Yassin. The date is April 9th, 1948. The village of Deir Yassin sits on the western outskirts of Jerusalem, on a hill overlooking the main road into the city. It is a small village, perhaps 700 residents, and it has, by most historical accounts, maintained a non-aggression pact with its Jewish neighbors. It poses no military threat to anyone. In the pre-dawn hours, forces from the Irgun and the Lehi, two of the most militant Zionist paramilitary groups, enter the village. What happens over the following hours has been documented by survivors, by subsequent investigations, and by records from the period. Between 110 and 250 civilians are killed, men, women, and children. Some are shot. Some are killed in their homes when those homes are blown up with the occupants still inside. Mutilations are reported. A small number of survivors are paraded through the streets of Jerusalem before being released. By May 14th, 1948, the day the State of Israel is declared and the British mandate expires, more than 300,000 Palestinians have already fled or been expelled. The Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, enter the war the following day. Their intervention is often presented as the cause of the Palestinian displacement. but the displacement is largely already accomplished before they arrive. The war with the Arab states does not create the Nakba, it continues it. By the time armistice agreements are signed in 1949, the numbers are staggering. More than 750,000 Palestinians are outside the borders of the new Israeli state. More than 400 Palestinian villages and towns have been demolished. Roughly 4 million acres of Palestinian land are under Israeli control. A society that had existed for centuries has been, in the space of less than 2 years, physically erased. The refugees settle in camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Gaza, the West Bank. They carry their house keys. They keep their title deeds. They name their children after the villages they came from. The United Nations creates an agency for them. UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. It begins operating in 1950 with a mandate to provide food, shelter, education, and health care. It is intended as a temporary measure, a bridge to the political solution that will allow the refugees to return or be compensated. 75 years later, UNRWA is still operating. Now, a man, Yasser Arafat, is born in Cairo on August 24, 1929, and to a Palestinian family with roots in Gaza and Jerusalem. His mother dies when he is 4. He is sent to live with relatives in Jerusalem, in the Old City, in the shadow of the Haram al-Sharif, the ancient walls that are themselves a compressed record of every civilization that has fought over this ground. As a young man studying civil engineering in Cairo, Arafat is short, stocky, driven by a kinetic urgency that everyone who meets him remarks on. He understands early something that takes political movements decades to learn. The fight for Palestinian rights is not only a military fight. It is a fight for international recognition, for legitimacy, for the right to be heard in the rooms where decisions are made. In 1958, he co-founds Fatah, a secular nationalist movement whose founding principle is straightforward. Palestinians have the right to their homeland, and that right will not be granted by the goodwill of the nations that dispossess them. It must be claimed. By 1969, Arafat is the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, the internationally recognized face of a people who have no state, no army, and no seat at the table where their fate is decided. The PLO builds what becomes a shadow state in exile: schools, hospitals, newspapers, military units. The institutional infrastructure of a people who have no territory but refuse to dissolve. In 1974, Arafat stands before the United Nations General Assembly, the first representative of a non-governmental organization to address the UN in plenary session. He wears his military uniform and his keffiyeh. He says, "I have come bearing an olive branch and a gun. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand. The PLO gains observer status at the UN within weeks. Palestine is, for the first time, present in the room. But the room, it turns out, is not where the decisions are made. Here is a detail to hold on to, because it will return with full weight much later in this story. The UN Partition Plan of 1947 allocated 55% of historic Palestine to a Jewish state in a territory where Jewish residents owned roughly 7% of the land. In the armistice agreements of 1949, Israel controls 78% of historic Palestine. In 1967, Israel will control 100%. Each step of this progression happens with the full knowledge of the international community. At each step, a UN resolution is passed. At each step, the resolution is not enforced. This is not a record of institutional failure. It is a record of institutional choice. June 5, 1967. The pre-dawn hours over Egypt. Israeli Air Force jets fly low, so low their radar signatures are barely distinguishable from commercial traffic. And in less than 3 hours, the Egyptian Air Force ceases to exist as a fighting force. Most of its planes are destroyed on the ground, parked in neat rows, their pilots still sleeping. Within 6 days, Israel has captured the West Bank, and East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. For Palestinians, the Six-Day War is called the Nakba, the setback. The word is almost gentle compared to what it describes. Approximately 430,000 more Palestinians are displaced. Many of them are displaced for the second time. Nakba survivors who fled in 1948, built new lives in the West Bank or Gaza under Jordanian or Egyptian administration, and now find themselves once again refugees, once again without protection, once again in the hands of forces that have given them no reason to trust their intentions. Under the resulting military occupation, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza live under military law, while Israeli settlers, whose presence is illegal under international law, live under civilian law. The same road, the same hill, the same olive grove, different legal systems for different people based on their ethnicity. The word international human rights organizations eventually settle on, for this arrangement is apartheid. The settlements expand, from a few thousand settlers in the late 1960s to hundreds of thousands by the time serious peace negotiations begin in the 1990s. Under every Israeli government, the settlements expand. There is no period in the 50-plus years of occupation when building stops. This is not a sidebar to the peace process. It is the peace process. Every year that diplomats talk, the facts on the ground change. But in the early 1990s, there is a moment when the trajectory seems to bend, when the possibility of a different future appears briefly to be real. To understand that moment, we need to understand two men. Their story is a parallel biography that begins in two completely different worlds and converges on a September afternoon in Washington. In a handshake, the whole world watches. The first man you already know, Yasser Arafat. By 1993, he is 64 years old, exiled to Tunis, internationally isolated, his organization weakened after its disastrous alignment with Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War. A man in a desperate position, looking for a lifeline. The second man is Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin is born in Jerusalem in 1922, grows up in Tel Aviv, and by his late teens is training with the Palmach, the elite fighting force of the mainstream Zionist military organization. He fights in the 1948 war that creates Israel and the 1967 war that creates the occupation. He rises to become chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, then ambassador to the United States, then prime minister, then defense minister. By 1993, he is 71 years old, back in the prime minister's office, and in possession of a conviction that has been slowly hardening for years, that you cannot occupy a people for 20 years, 40 years, a generation, without producing consequences more dangerous than whatever you were afraid of in the first place. The secret negotiations happen in Oslo, Norway, over months, conducted by low-level officials who meet in private houses outside the city. The breakthrough, when it comes, surprises even the negotiators. On September 9, 1993, Arafat sends Rabin a letter formally recognizing Israel's right to exist. Rabin replies, recognizing the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. 4 days later, on the lawn of the White House, in front of cameras and the watching world, Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shake hands. President Clinton stands behind them, his arms spread wide, as if physically holding the moment together. The Oslo Accords promise a phased withdrawal of Israeli forces from parts of the West Bank and Gaza, the creation of a Palestinian Authority, and negotiations toward a permanent settlement, Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, borders, to be completed by 1999. They are not completed by 1999, not by 2003, not by 2010. The permanent settlement is never reached. What Oslo delivers in practice is limited. Palestinian administrative control over small, fragmented patches of the West Bank and Gaza, surrounded by Israeli checkpoints. The settlements continue to expand throughout the Oslo years. The Palestinian Authority is created, but given neither territorial contiguity nor economic independence to function as a real government. The right of return for refugees, deferred, discussed, never resolved. And then, on November 4th, 1995, at a peace rally in Tel Aviv, Yitzhak Rabin is shot. The man who shoots him is Yigal Amir, a 25-year-old Israeli law student and Orthodox nationalist who believes the Oslo Accords betray the Jewish people's right to the land. He fires twice at close range. Rabin dies on the operating table 2 hours later, the first Israeli leader assassinated, killed by a fellow Israeli, for making peace. The moment is not just the death of a man, it is the death of a possibility. The Israeli political center shifts rightward. The settlement construction accelerates. Subsequent Israeli governments, including those of Benjamin Netanyahu, who campaigns explicitly against Oslo and wins the election that follows Rabin's assassination, pursue policies that make the two-state solution envisioned by Oslo progressively less geographically possible. Now, Gaza. By the late 1990s, Gaza is a place of extraordinary density and deprivation. 365 square kilometers, roughly the size of the city of Philadelphia, containing 2 million people, most of them refugees or the descendants of refugees from 1948. The unemployment rate is among the highest in the world. The water supply is overwhelmingly contaminated. The electricity grid operates for a fraction of the day. The border crossings are controlled by Israel and Egypt, and the movement of goods in and out is restricted and subject to constant interruption. In 1987, a protest movement had begun in Gaza, sparked almost randomly by a traffic accident in which an Israeli military vehicle killed 4 Palestinian workers. The first Intifada is largely a civilian uprising: stone-throwing young men, women blocking roads, general strikes, graffiti, boycotts of Israeli goods. Over the course of the next 6 years, more than 1,000 Palestinians are killed by Israeli forces. Out of the first Intifada emerges Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, founded in 1987 by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Hamas offers something Fatah does not in this moment: a clear moral framework drawn from Islamic tradition, a network of schools and hospitals that fills the gaps left by a dysfunctional system, and an unequivocal commitment to armed resistance. Hamas does not accept the Oslo process. Its founding charter contains language that is genuinely anti-Semitic, language it later revises, but the revision does not undo the original record. Hamas is often presented as the cause of the conflict in Gaza, but Hamas emerges from the conflict. It is a product of specific conditions: 2 decades of military occupation with no end in sight, an Oslo process delivering settlements instead of statehood, and a population that had lost faith in secular nationalist leadership that promised liberation and delivered a Palestinian authority many regarded as a subcontracted manager of the occupation. In 2006, Hamas wins the Palestinian legislative elections, the freest elections the Palestinian territories had ever held, as judged by international observers. The West, which had been calling for Palestinian democracy, rejects the result. The United States and European Union impose sanctions on the Palestinian Authority. Israel seals the crossings. The internationally supervised electoral process produces a result the international community refuses to accept, and the Palestinian people, who voted for Hamas largely in protest against Fatah's corruption, are punished for their vote. In June 2007, after a brief and bloody conflict with Fatah, Hamas takes full military control of the Gaza Strip. Israel and Egypt impose a blockade. The blockade is not, at this point, a response to October 7th. It is not a response to rockets. It is a response to an election result, and it begins in 2007. And from 2007 to October 2023, it remains in place without interruption. Here is what the blockade looks like, measured in lived conditions rather than abstractions. Before October 2023, Gaza's unemployment rate stands at 46%. For young people between 15 and 29, 62%. 78% of tap water is unfit for human consumption, contaminated by seawater intrusion and untreatable sewage. The power grid provides 11 hours of electricity per day. Israel restricts Palestinian fishing to a fraction of the waters allocated under Oslo. By 2022, 63% of Gazans are food insecure. And here is the plant and retrieve moment. Oslo envisioned Gaza as the economic heart of a future Palestinian state, a Mediterranean port, a free zone of commerce and development. That was the promise. 11 hours of electricity, contaminated water, and 63% food insecurity is what the promise looks like, 20 years later, on the ground. In 2000, the Second Intifada breaks out after the failure of the Camp David summit and a provocative visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound by Ariel Sharon. The Second Intifada is characterized by suicide bombings in Israeli cities that kill hundreds of Israeli civilians, and by Israeli military operations in Palestinian cities and refugee camps that kill more than 3,000 Palestinians in 4 years. It is a spiral of atrocity and counter-atrocity with no governing framework capable of stopping either side. In 2005, Sharon orders the withdrawal of Israeli settlements from Gaza. 8,000 settlers are removed. Israel withdraws its soldiers. Gaza becomes, in the official Israeli formulation, no longer occupied. What remains is a blockade, control of all sea access, all land crossings, the airspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, the population registry, but not legally occupation. In Gaza, the settlers leave, and then the blockade begins. And 2 years after the blockade begins, Hamas wins an election, and then the blockade tightens, and then the rockets start, and then the airstrikes, and then more rockets, and then more airstrikes. The cycle runs for 16 years with 4 major military operations, so 2008 and 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, each one more destructive than the last, each one followed by a ceasefire, each one followed by a return to blockade conditions that guarantee the conditions for the next cycle. The year 2023 arrives. Gaza is, in the words of former UK Prime Minister David Cameron, an open prison. Nearly 2 million people in 365 square kilometers, with restricted movement, contaminated water, inadequate health care, 60% food insecurity, and a sky that is never entirely safe. That year, something is being planned that almost no one in the world knows about. And on the morning of October 7th, 2023, it begins. October 7th, 2023. The early morning hours. Thousands of rockets fire simultaneously across southern Israel, overwhelming the Iron Dome in the south. Hamas fighters breach the security fence at multiple points, using bulldozers, motorcycles, paragliders. They enter the kibbutzim along the border, whose residents are woken by rockets and then very quickly by gunfire in the streets. The Nova Music Festival is underway in an open field near Kibbutz Re'im. Thousands of young Israelis are dancing. The sound system is still playing when the attackers arrive. What happens on October 7th is not a military operation. It is a massacre. 1,195 people are killed, including 250 at the festival and across multiple kibbutzim. The dead include babies, elderly residents of a community for Holocaust survivors, families killed in their safe rooms, people shot while running, people burned alive. 251 people are taken hostage into Gaza. The youngest is a 9-month-old infant. The oldest is an 85-year-old woman. It is the single deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. There is no framework within which this is acceptable. There is no context that renders the murder of civilians at a music festival a legitimate act of resistance. Every argument about the history of the occupation, every documented fact about the blockade, every legitimate grievance the Palestinian people have accumulated over 75 years. None of it justifies what is done on October 7th. The people killed at the Nova Festival did not build the blockade. The babies in the kibbutzim did not design the settlements. Grief is not a political argument. The grief of the Israeli families who lost someone on October 7th is total, and it is real, and it is permanent, and nothing in what follows diminishes it. Israel responds. Within hours, the Israeli Air Force begins bombing Gaza. The scale is, within days, unlike anything Gaza has experienced before. More than 1 million Palestinians are displaced from northern Gaza in the first week, ordered by Israel to move south. The orders arrive over radio, in leaflets dropped from aircraft as text messages. People pack what they can and move. The southern areas they are ordered to move to are then also bombed. By October 7th, 2024, 1 year after the attacks, more than 42,000 Palestinians have been reported killed. The breakdown, as documented by the Gaza Ministry of Health: 13,319 children, 7,216 women, 3,447 elderly, every one of them with a name, a family, a specific place where they lived. The numbers are almost impossible to hold, so let us hold some of them differently. The Al-Najjar family. By August 2024, the UN has verified the deaths of 138 members of the Al-Najjar family, killed across 18 separate incidents. Among them, 35 women and 62 children. The Al-Astal family, 94 members killed, including 33 women and 45 children. These are not statistics. These are families. Extended networks of grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles, all living near one another, as families do. In a single strike, a family can lose 3 generations, and then the family name is added to a list that no one reads. By the end of 2023, the entire population of Gaza, 2.2 million people, is classified by the UN's Food Security Assessment in crisis-level hunger or worse. Within that, 576,000 face catastrophic hunger. International aid organizations warn that more people could die from starvation and disease than from the military campaign itself. The aid system collapses almost immediately. The Rafah border crossing closes repeatedly. Trucks queue for weeks in Egypt, loaded with food and medicine, waiting for Israeli approval that does not come. On April 1st, 2024, 7 aid workers from the World Central Kitchen are killed by an Israeli airstrike. They travel in clearly marked WCK vehicles whose GPS coordinates have been shared with the Israeli Defense Forces in advance. They are killed in 3 consecutive strikes on 3 separate vehicles. Among the dead, a British Palestinian man, 3 Australians, a Pole, and a Canadian. Their deaths bring the total number of humanitarian workers killed in Gaza in 6 months to nearly 200, the highest rate of aid worker deaths in any modern conflict. The aid restriction continues. Now, we arrive at the most consequential legal development in the history of this conflict. And at the moment that most directly answers the question planted at the start of this story: what happens to international law when the most powerful state in the world chooses to ignore it? In December 2023, the Republic of South Africa files a case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, under the Genocide Convention. South Africa alleges that Israel's military campaign in Gaza constitutes or risks constituting genocide against the Palestinian people. The filing is based on statements by Israeli officials, military orders, the documented civilian death toll, and the pattern of destruction of civilian infrastructure. In January 2024, the ICJ issues provisional measures. It does not, at this stage, rule on whether genocide is occurring. What it does is order Israel, unanimously, to take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of acts of genocide, to allow basic humanitarian aid into Gaza, and to preserve evidence. The court's jurisdiction is not in dispute. The order is legally binding. 11 of the 17 judges, including Israel's own judge, the Israeli jurist Aharon Barak, vote in favor of the humanitarian aid measure. Israel does not comply. The aid flow does not significantly increase. The military operations continue. The blockade tightens. In March 2025, Israel imposes a complete blockade on all humanitarian aid, not a partial restriction, not a slowing of the flow, but a total stop. For nearly 80 days, not a single truck of food, fuel, water, or medicine enters Gaza through Israeli-controlled crossings. I want to pause here for a moment because what just happened, an international court issuing a unanimous, legally binding order to prevent potential genocide, and a state simply choosing not to comply, raises a question that I find myself returning to again and again. If the institutions that were built specifically to prevent atrocities can be ignored by a state that is militarily protected and diplomatically shielded by the world's most powerful government, if the International Court of Justice can issue an order and have it treated as a polite suggestion, then what does international law actually mean? Not as an abstraction. In practice, what does it mean for the people whose only protection it offers? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Here is what happened next. In October 2024, the Israeli Knesset passes 2 laws that together effectively ban UNRWA, the United Nations agency providing food, education, and health care to Palestinian refugees since 1950, from operating in any territory Israel considers its own. International UNRWA staff are denied entry to Gaza. The food stockpiled outside, enough for over 1 million people, cannot get in. The rationale is that UNRWA has been infiltrated by Hamas. A UN investigation finds that 9 of UNRWA's 30,000 staff had alleged links to Hamas. 9 out of 30,000. The 9 are dismissed. The finding of no broader Hamas control is noted by no one with the power to act on it. The laws remain in force. By November 2025, the UN reports that nearly 70,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since October 7, 2023. Studies published in The Lancet conclude this figure is a significant undercount, capturing only direct deaths, not the thousands who die from the collapse of the healthcare system, from starvation, from disease, or from wounds sustained while still buried under rubble no one has the equipment to reach. The International Criminal Court issues arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and his then defense minister, Yoav Gallant, on charges including the use of starvation as a method of warfare. Technically, they cannot travel to any of the roughly 124 ICC member states without risk of arrest. In practice, they travel as they choose. And in the UN Security Council, every resolution calling for a ceasefire, 14 of them across the first year of the war, is vetoed by the United States of America. This is the architecture of impunity, not conspiracy, not accident. Architecture, the systematic arrangement of international legal and political mechanisms so that certain states are protected from consequences and others are not. The architecture was not built on October 7th, 2023. It was built over decades. What October 7th did was strip away whatever remained of the pretense that it was neutral. By late 2024, the words being used in international legal proceedings are words that, before this conflict, were treated as the most consequential in the human rights lexicon, words whose use required extraordinary evidence and extraordinary restraint. In December 2024, Amnesty International concludes that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Human Rights Watch reaches the same conclusion. The UN Human Rights Council follows in September 2025. The International Court of Justice has already found the case plausible. And still, the bombs fall. And still, the aid does not get in. And still, the vetoes come. The second Nakba, the word that Palestinian families have been using since October 2023, the word their grandparents used in 1948 to name the last catastrophe, is no longer a metaphor. Now, there is only one thing left to confront. What a reckoning looks like when the world's most powerful institutions have watched a catastrophe unfold in real time, in full view, and chosen to keep watching. By October 2025, a third ceasefire is in effect, the first having collapsed, the second broken by an Israeli surprise attack in March 2025. The shooting has, for the moment, largely stopped. What the ceasefire reveals, what cameras can now reach, is this: 90% of Gaza's civilian infrastructure is damaged or destroyed. Most hospitals are non-functional. More than 300 UNRWA installations, schools, health centers, warehouses have been struck. Entire neighborhoods are not damaged. They are gone, flattened to rubble, building after building, the kind of destruction that international legal scholars have given a specific name: herbicide, the deliberate destruction of urban space as a strategy of war. 1.45 million people, roughly two-thirds of Gaza's population, face winter without adequate shelter. In tents, in the shells of buildings, in ruins. Winter in Gaza means cold and rain and illness and a medical system that no longer exists to treat it. Now, the survivors. Ibrahim has been displaced 5 times. He is a name in a UN report, one of hundreds of thousands of displaced persons who have moved from place to place across Gaza as evacuation orders and military operations pushed the civilian population back and forth across the Strip. At some point, a UN official asks him where he will go next. He says, "We know it is not safe here, but we have nowhere else to go anymore." He has been saying some version of this sentence for 2 years. Each time he says it, he is in a different place. A doctor working with an international medical organization in central Gaza in early 2024 describes his intensive care unit. No painkillers, no antibiotics. Patients arrive with shrapnel wounds, crush injuries, burns, already weakened by malnutrition, their bodies without the reserves to fight infection. He begins sharing his own protein bars with patients before surgery, trying to build up their strength enough that the procedure has a chance of working. Some of them still die from wounds that, in a functioning healthcare system, would be entirely survivable. He says later, the hardest part was not the work. The hardest part was knowing that the situation was not accidental. A woman named Sama, 27 years old, is interviewed by a reporter in 2024 in a shelter in central Gaza. She describes getting up before dawn each morning to queue for water, carrying her child on one hip, her jerry cans in the other hand. She describes the queue, which stretches for what she estimates as 300 meters, moving very slowly. She describes the day the distribution point was closed because an airstrike had landed nearby the night before, and no one knew whether it was safe. She describes going back to her tent and explaining to her 3-year-old son why there was no water for him to drink. She describes what she tells him. She says, "I told him we were saving it for later." She says, "I did not have any for later." And then there are the children who have never known anything else. UNICEF estimates that by early 2025, more than 44,000 children in Gaza require urgent intervention for acute malnutrition. The UN's figures show that 35,000 children had lost one or both parents in the first year of the war alone. A generation of children is growing up in tents, in rubble, in UN shelters that were schools 3 years ago. They attend temporary learning spaces, tarpaulins stretched between poles, plastic chairs on concrete floors, where UNRWA teachers try to provide education because the alternative is nothing. In the West Bank, in the same period, more than 1,000 Palestinians are killed by Israeli forces or settlers. 32,000 Palestinian refugees in Tulkarm camp have been forcibly displaced by an Israeli military operation that begins in January 2025 and shows no sign of ending. The legal reckoning proceeds on its own timetable. In September 2025, the UN Human Rights Council publishes its formal conclusion. The State of Israel bears responsibility for the failure to prevent genocide, the commission of genocide, and the failure to punish genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The words are there in the document. They are not alleged. They are not disputed by the UN body that issued them. They are findings, arrived at through months of evidence collection, testimony from survivors, analysis of military orders and public statements, and documented destruction. The word, genocide, is in the formal record of the United Nations. Benjamin Netanyahu calls the report false and absurd. His government accuses the Human Rights Council of anti-Semitism. The United States, as it has done consistently throughout this crisis, declines to treat the finding as binding. And here is the systemic complicity thread arriving at its conclusion, not with a bang, but with the quiet procedural precision of an institution doing exactly what it has always done. The UN Security Council is the body with legal authority to enforce international court orders and impose sanctions. The United States holds a permanent veto. Over the course of the Gaza war, the United States vetoes or blocks 14 Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire, each passing with overwhelming majorities, each nullified by a single vote. This is not exceptional. The United States has vetoed more than 40 Security Council resolutions on Israel and Palestine since 1972. This is the architecture, and it has been standing for more than half a century. The ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant remain active and unenforced. The ICJ has issued orders requiring Israel to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza 3 times in different formulations. Compliance, as documented by independent humanitarian monitors, remains partial at best. By January 2026, for the first time since the war began, Gazans receive enough aid to meet their basic food needs. The UN describes this as a significant improvement. The previous baseline against which this improvement is measured was famine. Now, if you have stayed with this story from the beginning, thank you. This channel is dedicated to telling exactly these kinds of stories. The ones where the scale of what happened demands more than a headline, more than a 3-minute report, more than a statistics breakdown. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It means these stories keep being told, and it keeps them free for everyone to access. And one more thing before we close. What does a story like this one ask of us? Not as consumers of information, not as people scrolling past another crisis, but as people who now know what we know. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear them. And now, the final reckoning. There is a question that gets asked about this conflict every time this conflict is discussed in comments sections and dinner tables and political debates in countries thousands of miles away. It is asked with the weary authority of someone who has thought carefully and arrived at a conclusion. The question is, they were offered peace and they refused it. The reference is usually to Camp David 2000 or Oslo. Let us look at what was actually offered. At Camp David in 2000, the Israeli proposal did not include a contiguous Palestinian state. It offered a Palestinian entity in roughly 80% of the West Bank, divided into separate cantons by Israeli roads and settlement blocks, with Israeli military presence in the Jordan Valley, without full sovereignty over East Jerusalem, and with no meaningful resolution of the right of return for Palestinian refugees. The Palestinians offered a counterproposal. The talks broke down without agreement. The claim that Arafat simply rejected peace and walked away has been comprehensively contested by numerous participants, including American negotiators, and by the historical record. But let us go further. Even if you believe the most generous interpretation of Camp David, even if you think Palestinians should have accepted it, you still need to explain why, in every year since 1967, Israeli settlement construction has continued on Palestinian land in violation of international law, with full U.S. knowledge, and why the settlement population has grown from 60,000 in 1993 to more than 700,000 today, making the two-state solution geographically close to impossible. You need to explain to the families of the 13,000 children killed in Gaza since October 2023 why the question of who started it is the most important thing to understand about their deaths. The dismissal, they refused peace, requires you to begin the story in 2000 or 1993. It requires you not to ask what happened in 1948, not to ask who built the settlements, not to ask who supplies the weapons, not to ask who cast the vetoes. The question of what Palestinians should have done is a question for diplomats and historians. The question of what the rest of us do with what we now know belongs to all of us, because here is what we know. The institutional architecture of the post-World War II world, built explicitly to prevent mass atrocity has failed, systematically and repeatedly, to protect the Palestinian people, not through ignorance, in full view. With documentation that runs to thousands of pages, the International Court of Justice has issued its orders. The International Criminal Court has issued its warrants. The UN Human Rights Council, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, all have used the word genocide. We know this because the institutions whose entire purpose is to identify these things have told us so. And here's what that knowledge demands. It demands that we stop treating this as a story about two sides of equal power, making equally reasonable claims in a dispute that is simply very complicated. The power differential is not a detail. It is the story. One side has the fourth most powerful military in the world, backed by the world's largest military power, with nuclear weapons and F-35 jets and billions in annual military aid. The other has been under military occupation, or blockade, or both, for more than half a century. The complication of this conflict is not that it is hard to understand. The complication is that understanding it clearly requires acknowledging things that are uncomfortable for the world's most powerful governments. That discomfort is not the same as genuine complexity. It is the discomfort of accountability. There are Israelis and Jewish people around the world who have said publicly what international institutions have said in their reports, that what is happening in Gaza is not self-defense, that occupation cannot be permanent, that the blockade is collective punishment, that the dead children are not acceptable losses. Some have marched, some have been arrested, some have refused military service. They are part of this story too. The wound called Gaza is not the wound of one people alone. It is a wound in the idea that civilizations can establish rules for themselves and apply those rules consistently. It is a wound in the principle that institutions built to protect the vulnerable can be trusted to do so. It is a wound in the story that the powerful tell themselves about their power, that it reflects merit and law and the right order of things, rather than the accumulated inheritance of choices made without accountability and without consequence. The keys are still being passed from one generation to the next. The title deeds are still being kept. The names of the destroyed villages are still being given to children who have never seen them. There is a woman in a tent in Gaza right now, and telling her son they are saving the water for later. She has nowhere else to go. Palestinian poet Rashid Hussein, who spent his life writing in the space between the olive tree and the gun, between the longing for peace and the reality of what peace costs when the conditions for it are never allowed to exist, wrote the words that should close this story. Not because they are hopeful, but because they are true. He wrote, "I oppose hurting even a blade of grass. I am not in favor of tears, but when hell consumes my people, how can I stop my poem from becoming a gun?"